Hello and welcome back to Radio Rothbard. I'm Ryan McMakin. I'm a senior editor at the Mises Institute, and I am here with Tho Bishop, my associate editor. And this time we're going to talk a little bit about what the world is going to look like post-Trump in terms of the American political scene, and what maybe would Murray Rothbard have thought of it and wanted to do. And unless Trump pulls out some sort of legal miracle from his current lawsuits, we're assuming he is going to lose. Although, of course, I'm in favor of efforts to make the electoral system look illegitimate because he's asking some of the hard questions through his lawsuits that aren't being asked. However, I don't think he's going to be able to pull it out. And I'm assuming a Trump loss. And so we're going to talk about what does that mean for 2022, for the Republican Party also going forward. And part of what we do here on Radio Rothbard is to really try and carry forward a little bit about how Rothbard talked about political activism and the views that he had on political parties and so on. And it was brought to my attention recently, an article he had talking about the necessity of taking over an actual political party if you want to have any success in repealing bad laws and in actually shrinking the size of the state, at least through anything other than bloody and destructive revolution, which is not his preferred method. And in an article on Konkin on libertarian strategy from 1981, as was recently pointed out to me, he talks about this and notes how you have to have some sort of libertarian faction actually take over a political party or at least exercise significant power within it. And he says without that, you simply can't repeal bad laws, you can't block other laws, you're just simply advising from the outside. Now, this doesn't assume a total takeover of the party, but at least enough to actually influence votes and to actually run legislation. And this has been done in the past. As we've noted here on Radio Rothbard before, and as Rothbard notes, examples of this are the Democratic Party in the US and the Liberals in England, and he also notes the Progressives in Germany. So looking a little bit at this context, we have to ask ourselves, okay, is there any chance of moving forward from where we are and maybe encouraging any sort of serious and significant opposition to the left's current plan of further taking over the U.S. economy, essentially, of imposing more lockdowns, of doing a wide variety of efforts to really revolutionize the economy even more in favor of really what you could only define as socialism if it involves further takeover of the private sector. And so here talking about it with me, as I noted, is Tho today. And I think, though, looking at the party, I'm a little bit leaning in the direction of my primary concern being that the party just goes back to the old Bush, Romney, Dick Cheney sort of party that existed before. And this concerns me because I'm very old and I can remember 20 years ago when the Republican Party was really at its height of terribleness in many ways. And these were the post 9/11 days. These were the days where the GOP was giving us the TSA, the Patriot Act, and where it really set the stage for massive increases in government spending. Now, it's, of course, clear that Trump had no interest whatsoever in controlling spending or deficit spending of any kind. But this pattern was already well set during the Bush years, when it was clear that when you had the Republicans with total control of the federal government, they just spent and spent and spent and had no interest whatsoever in controlling the power of the state. And so the question now is, I think, is the GOP just going to go back to business as usual, or is there a chance that this idea of Trumpism as really this more throw a monkey wrench in the machinery of the U.S. government sort of philosophy. Will that sustain itself or gain any traction or continue even without Trump as the formal head?
To your point about spending, let's just remind the audience that before there was Stephanie Kelton, the original MMTer was really Dick Cheney, who had the quote about deficits don't matter. So really, he's the pioneer of MMT in my book. It is cold outside here today, but I'm here to warm your heart, because I'm actually extremely white-pilled about the political arrangement we find ourselves in. And really, the results of this election could not be going any better for our perspective, because even though there's all sorts of concerns about policy that Trump could come up with, and we still have to make sure that we don't get into a war with Iran between now and January 20th. That's kind of, kind of been one of those was big question marks of the last 4 years. But what's happening right now is you have Trump actively going after members of the GOP that aren't willing to question the legitimacy of this election, only kind of further solidifies this phenomenon that we've seen, that the beauty of Trump has always been the reaction of his enemies to Trump. The Bush wing destroyed itself not because of some profound philosophical movement from the Bush years. It was the fact that the Bush family and Bush political operatives and the National Review's big against Trump, Purple magazine, and all of these institutions of the pre-existing Bush era were just so offended by Trump's aesthetics, right? If they'd played a smart game, they could have flattered Trump, could have waltzed in, outside of with perhaps some differences, right? I mean, there's a few kind of, he's always had some protectionist views on trade. He's always kind of had a few, views on foreign policy, fine, consistent through the 80s. But for the most part, they could have gone in and done whatever they wanted. They didn't play that game smartly, and they're paying the consequences for it. I think there's actually a greater chance that some of these Bush-era people rise within the Democratic Party, considering how Biden is not even trying to pretend. He's not even throwing any real token nominations over to, it's called the genuine political left, rather than like the Obama era, the neoliberals, as left Twitter would call them. And so what we have right now is a situation where Trump's enemies, for the most part, tend to be our enemies. And I think that you're setting up for a situation where, much better than having a better than average president is having a complete disaster at president. And when you have Joe Biden going into office with 40+% of the population from Trump supporters thinking he didn't legitimately win, and then let's say Gallup polls show like 35% of voters, majority of the Democrats have like an explicitly negative view of capitalism. Let's say it's half of that are like the genuine diehard Rose Twitter hardcore Bernie Sanders people. Look at it, it's 17%. Biden's going to go into it with half the country already hating his guts. And again, as people that want to see the presidency delegitimized and weakened, I think this is a great situation. And I think that the Republican base is so lockstep with, they trust Trump more than they trust the Republican Party. And so this dynamic sets, I think, up for a very interesting political environment. You never want to speak for people smarter than yourselves, but I think Murray would be having a blast with the current situation we find ourselves in.
And we should probably try and be specific, too, about what are we talking about when we talk about Trumpism, right? One thing about this administration is there was very little focus on specific policy and very little talk about it, at least. But there were identifiable trends. And I think if we were to ask ourselves, what would Rothbard focus on in terms of pushing the Trump angle, I think you got three things. You've got the focus on improving foreign policy. And it's important to remember that Rothbard's foreign policy views were at the center of his overall views, that anti-interventionist foreign policy was very near and dear to him. He absolutely put that before he put domestic policy. And so he was then the reverse of your standard Cold War Republican who was their primary focus was on defeating the commies, even if that produced 50 million corpses, as some of them were prone to actually admit publicly. They didn't mind mountains of human bodies so long as it defeated the commies. And domestic civil liberties, well, I mean, maybe you could have some of those if there was time. Of course, Rothbard was the opposite of that. So looking at Trumpism, it would seem the focus would be on really wanting to scale back foreign presence, foreign policy, aggressiveness. And you could look at Trump and say, well, he was always talking about invading other countries and so on. Yes, but none of that ever actually happened. And there was actually a retrenchment, if anything, and a pullback on troops, which predictably the Pentagon and those deep state types opposed tooth and nail and bragged about it. In fact, bragged about that they didn't follow orders from the president. They kept those troops there in Afghanistan. So they were very happy. Clearly, the foreign policy establishment, clearly the military in this country wants to maintain a very aggressive stance, and Trump didn't. So I think Rothbard would be really gung-ho on that idea and wanting to continue that, especially also issues around attacking the deep state, continue to attack the CIA and the FBI and really illustrate. And a lot of the good Trump did on that was accidental. I don't think he planned that ahead of time, but really just exposing that the CIA and the FBI are headed by people who hate the average American voter and want to overturn elections when it doesn't go their way. And so certainly we could probably assume that Rothbard would be all in favor of that. I think, and Rothbard, of course, would recognize there's no chance here of any decrease in real spending, the fiscal policy. That's probably not going to get much ground on that. But other issues probably about repealing laws that protect the ruling class, maybe about Section 230 in regards to these tech firms. It seems to be that Rothbard was very much in favor of allowing lawsuits against people who actually violated your rights and for repealing artificial protections against lawsuits against certain parties. And we could probably maybe guess that that Section 230 protecting people like Zuckerberg would probably have to go if we had a good regime in place. And then the other issue is encouraging decentralization. Certainly, I think that the Trump administration, not on purpose again so much, but just the fact that it basically ignored for the most part a lot of efforts at more the local levels to get under the radar on federal laws and ignore them. And we might see much more aggressive action from a Biden administration or a Harris administration wanting to end local autonomy on those issues. So I think maybe those would be some of the areas that Rothbard would want to really continue to pursue in the post-Trump populist age. And I want to ask you, because I've seen you comment on this in social media and so on, do you think the foreign policy anti-interventionism angle has any chance of surviving? I know that they didn't talk about it much in the administration, but has it gotten more traction within the GOP, and is his core voter more in favor of really scaling back that sort of thing?
Bay County, Florida, where I live, is I think it was like a plus 53 county. Okay, like this is Trump country. Again, you have a Trump boat parade. You're gonna have 4,000 people show up. That's just where I live. And I'm not going to say that foreign policy is kind of a major motivating issue for any of these people, which is why I think it's very promising. If you looked at the Republican convention, for example, I mean, it was like 1 out of every 3 speakers was making this big deal about the fact that Trump didn't start any new wars. The Trump administration was actively bragging about it, I think, more than it resonated with your average Trump voter, because I think that, for the most part, I mean, particularly when you consider how isolated the actual consequences of war from a bloodshed standpoint, we don't even consider the finances anymore. I don't think that's necessarily the motivating touchstone for most Republican voters. But what's brilliant about what's happening right now is that the ones that are motivated by it are the ones that have seen the opportunity that Trump presents. And so you have this great drumbeat. Right-wing politics going forward is going to be defined as much as focusing on the enemies within the U.S. as enemies abroad, whereas Bush-era republicanism was all about going abroad to hunt monsters that wanted to take away our freedoms. I can talk to people that were Santorum voters in 2008 here, and they want to get rid of the FBI because the FBI was anti-Trump. They're skeptical of Mad Dog Mattis because Mattis criticized Trump. They're skeptical of the CIA because the CIA has been skeptical of Trump. their underlying motivation isn't necessarily the benefits of a humble foreign policy. It's simply the fact that Trump was a defender of what they see as their interest, right? They thought that the political class took them for granted, hated them, didn't care if they were successful. Trump did. And therefore, anybody that's anti-Trump is really anti-them. And that now includes this larger military-industrial complex. And again, I think this is an example of where the Trump phenomenon is so much bigger than policy. You can project so much of your own views on this. I mean, you have a lot of kind of national conservatives, right? This kind of rising American nationalist class. The ones that constantly railing against, the Republicans were taken over by libertarians, which, it's kind of silly on its face. They keep promoting this idea of like economic nationalism. But, this is actually a very interesting study by the Center for the Study of Partisanship and Ideology. Not exactly the best named group out there, but this study of what was the appeal for voters of Trumpism. It was not policy. It was not tariffs per se because they're protectionists at heart. It was cultural matters. They were concerned about the consequences of immigration more than they were, necessarily motivated by, genuine racial animus, right? But they were just concerned that immigration comes in, lowers their wages. That was a cultural concern more than a kind of a racial-driven concern. Concerned about political correctness, concerned about tech censorship, concerned about these sort of things, more than any set of political ideas. And all of this kind of resonates. There's this quote from one of Rothbard's articles on right-wing populism. Libertarians have long been puzzled about which groups to reach out to. The answer is simple. Everyone is not enough, because to be relevant politically, we must concentrate strategically on those groups who are most oppressed and who have the most social leverage. We need to identify the largest group of voters out there that feel that the state is working against them. And again, I think that to a T really describes, what Trumpism offers people like Rand Paul, who has played that game as good as anyone. Thomas Massey, who, again, Trump was railing against. I mean, he recognizes that, the same people that are drawn to Trump are the ones that are the most drawn to his message. This year, this has really played out in the biggest way on anti-lockdowns and that battle going on. Was he grounded by a genuine desire for liberty and railing against blue state governors locking down people? Probably not. It was political opportunism. It was concerned about the economy because he knew he needed that. But regardless, I mean, he was relative, particularly to other world leaders. Bolsonaro down in Brazil, he perhaps is the leader in not caring what anyone thinks about the COVID virus. But Trump, after some early kind of great concern, ended up being a pretty strong anti-lockdown guy relative to modern politics today. Again, I think this goes to not, again, an underlying philosophical view, but simply the fact that, he recognized that it was the working class people that would hurt the most. And those were the people that liked him. And Trump likes people that likes Trump.
Yes. I wish he had done more.
Yeah, he could have done a lot more on a lot of things, right? I mean, he could have cut taxes more. He could have done this, but, he likes people that like Trump.
The question is then, all right, we'll find out, I suppose, a lot in 2022. I think when it comes to the primaries, when it comes to electing people to the House, we'll have a better idea of this faction's staying power and also what it represents. I think in the longer term, probably it doesn't help us as the laissez-faire people to continue just along the cultural lines. This is the first populist movement that actually encourages the central bank to be inflationist. Because in the past, the populists generally took the opposite view, whether it was the Cleveland Dems or the Jacksonians, the Jeffersonians, and so on. But now we've got this populist leader who wanted Jerome Powell to print more money. So the question is, how does this translate into a more deliberate policy agenda over time, and perhaps getting his followers to see specific policies that actually help them, that they are in fact getting screwed by the central bank, and yes, true enough, by these intelligence organizations and by the high-ranking people in the Pentagon and so on. But what will that look like in 2022, in 2024? It looks like the Republican Party will be doing fine. And I say that based on the fact that the Republicans, under Trump, even though we were told what a weak candidate he was and how he had ruined the Republican Party and so on. The down ballot, and of course, this may actually indicate some fraud there, but taking it at face value, down ballot, the Republicans did very, very well. And they gained a trifecta in 2 states. That is where they had total control of the state legislature and the governor's office. They took over in Montana and in New Hampshire, where they had not had the trifecta before. They maintained the trifecta, I believe, in 22 other states, whereas the Dems have the trifecta in about 17 states, I believe. And this is important because it allows the GOP to engage and be in charge in the redistricting process. And so this is going to make it a lot easier for the Republicans to protect themselves in the House and to draw districts in such a way that they will be able to probably increase their presence in both state legislatures and in Congress, at least in the House of Representatives. So it's the Republican Party itself will do fine, but it's all about who is going to win these primaries coming up, and is this going to translate from power at the state level to the federal level? Now, both you and I know that the state legislatures often serve as the training ground for future federal politicians and so on. And do you think that there's maybe been more progress by populist Republicans, by truly anti-establishment Republicans at the state level? And if so, will that then translate into more presence in the Congress in the future? Just looking forward to 22 to 26 and beyond, what does the current situation tell us about the next 10 years?
Once again, I remain quite optimistic for a number of reasons. And for one, I mean, I think there's all sorts of interesting things. For one, if we look backwards very quickly, just and into the ways that again, this Trump era has borne good fruit already. One of the most underappreciated races, and I think it's one that particularly given the growth of the GOP within Florida this year, which is just an interesting battleground because of some of the various demographic issues here and all of that. I mean, the growing sentiment is that, oh, Florida's the future of the Republican Party generally. Well, if Florida's the future of the Republican Party, it's worth looking at the recent past, because in 2018, you had a major governor's race. And in that, it was the epitome of Bush-era Republicanism versus Trump-era Republicanism. Because in that race, you had Adam Putnam, who was the agricultural commissioner. There's a lot of bad Republicans out there. I mean, I don't want to discredit Peter King and some of the other ones, but one of the worst Republicans in America. Okay, as agricultural commissioner, he relished in cracking down on mom and pop dairies because they weren't putting additives in the milk that he thought was very important. In Congress, he was one of those Bush-era toadies that not only was he bad on the Patriot Act and wars and all of the spending, he voted for the stupid light bulb ban and things like that. But, he talked a good Trump game, right? He tried to wear a Trump coat. His slogan was Florida first, right? Just trying to tap into that as much as possible, because he wasn't a dumb man. He was just an unprincipled one. On the other side, you had Ron DeSantis, who ran a terrible campaign, had very little charisma, but he got the most important thing possible. He got 3 Trump tweets praising Ron DeSantis because he was an ally in Congress. And it's interesting because going from Congress to running in a state like Florida, which has numerous major markets, right, very expensive TV markets, it's hard to run a statewide race. He had no background in Tallahassee. He was just, just a congressman. 3 Trump tweets. Ron DeSantis beats a guy. I mean, Adam Putnam spent his entire adult life running for governor. He came in, he was a state rep, I think he was 18, right? His entire adult life was spent for this moment. 3 Trump tweets, and he loses by, I think it was 20 plus points. In Bay County, where he spent a whole bunch of time and he had the endorsement of every single major political figure in the Panhandle, he lost Bay County by 20 points because 3 Trump tweets mattered more than an entire political career. And so I think going forward, I think what you're going to end up seeing is more of these DeSantis versus Putnam-like battles play out. Right now, you have the Republicans that want Trump to just shut up and take the loss, and are outraged that how dare you question these, the ones that Rand Paul, right? He's getting a lot of flack because he's asking valid questions about the legitimacy of the election. Rand is playing this game of trying to play up the common ground that he has with Trump. That's what he's been doing for the last 4 years. He's in a much stronger position with the GOP now than he was when he ran in 2016. And his strategy prior to 2016 was trying to be an ally to Mitch McConnell, not necessarily on giving a principle per se, still battling the Patriot Act, and was taking some good stances, but he was trying to play an inside game with Washington, trying to do the opposite of what his father did. Didn't work out. Rand's much stronger now because he's been a reliable ally on a lot of these Trump versus anti-Trump interpolitical battles, while still being strong on against war, voting against war powers in Iran, etc. I think that strategy is good. But to your point about this opportunity for what we're seeing at the state level and things like that, one of the growing institutions out there is Young Americans for Liberty, which has, again, this election cycle, they elected over 100 state reps. One of them was an actual capital L libertarian up in Wyoming. That was an interesting race because it was a libertarian versus a Democrat, no Republican. The libertarian was a well-known figure in the community, was known as being a conservative libertarian, and I think was fairly pro-Trump. He won that seat. First time a libertarian, capital L, has won a state seat since I think 2002. So it was the one libertarian plus the rest of them were Republicans winning state house seats around the country. Even more interesting, state of New Hampshire, which New Hampshire is a very interesting state political body. In spite of it being a tiny state, they have, I think, the largest state assembly out there. So I know that some of your articles in the past, along with Mark Thornton, have done work on highlighting the significance of having a good representative to voter ratio. Republicans won 135, I think, seats in the state house this cycle, while Trump performed worse in 2020 statewide than he did in 2016 against Hillary Clinton, which again is an interesting question, not impossible, but an interesting point. So now the Republicans actually have taken over that state assembly. And my understanding is I think one of the free state sort of people is in a strong position to not only be in a position of significance in New Hampshire politics, but I think it's actually going to be the Republican leader in the New Hampshire House. And so again, this is just kind of showing that this populist era, and you see it reflected with some of the policy pushes at some of the state level. You got Anthony Sabatini here in Florida, who's making a big deal over anti-vaccine requirements, because apparently there's a Florida law that actually gives them the power to push vaccines in the age of COVID. You have gun rights, voter security issues, things like this. It's an era where people that are interested in liberty and can learn from lessons of Rothbard, this is a great moment on getting into some of these party structures and in these institutional wings, where, again, if you're interested in political victories, it matters. And I think one of the big issues going forward, you mentioned the Fed and Trump being a pro-inflation president, because he definitely wanted those stock market numbers to go up higher and higher. At the federal side, I think what's going to be interesting is the battle over cryptocurrency and perhaps even gold taxes. And you have some of the Ron Paul parallel currency bills out there. One of the very Trumpy congressmen is, I believe he's a doctor, Paul Gosar of Arizona. I think he's one of the members. I think they're building like an America First caucus. He's very pro-crypto. And I think that's going to be one of the issues going forward. That the future of populism, I think, from in terms of a policy standpoint, at a federal and even an international level. If we have anyone from Europe out there, you try to get any right-wing movements out there interested as well, because Bitcoin and gold and these decentralized de-state currencies, I think, are going to be an increasingly important policy battle on protecting your rights to those. As we see destabilization with the fiat currencies, given the incredible money printing of this year, and plus just the push towards central bank digital currencies, the IMF trying to have an expanded role here. I mean, Mark Carney was talking about the need to de-dollarize the global economy, to have a more one world, depoliticized currency, right? I think that's going to be one of the battles where if populists are looking for like a strong anti-globalist policy platform, that monetary issue might become sexy again in a way that it hasn't since the Sam Tilden days. That's where we should be focusing our energies in terms of building up attention, because I think that is going to go to the core of a lot of the intersection of good economics and good politics in the near future. Sorry for my rant there. I'm just very excited about what's going on.
No, I thought that was very informative, and I'm going to spring one last question on you. And the question is, okay, here's this is some of the people involved, gone through some of these policies, but what's so important for so many people really is what is the party look what does the party look like aesthetically? And what I mean by that is, and here's an example. So back during the Bush days, I remember it was maybe the 2004 presidential convention, right? So they were nominating Bush. And I remember watching all the speeches. And I remember making a comment to my wife about how many more blonde women in pink suits can they put up here to give speeches? And it just became so clear that this is the party of well-to-do suburban white people. And I just wondered, how much reach does that have? Not that those people aren't a significant a group of Americans, and my father is an Anglo-Saxon suburban white person, right? So I have nothing against these people. However, it seems that Trump and the party were actually making some headway here. I noticed lots of candidates with Spanish last names were getting elected. I noticed that Trump was doing much better with a lot of these Hispanic groups in Texas, and that seems to have been a big factor in preventing the Democratic Party from doing better. And can the GOP really embrace this idea that seems to have taken hold under Trump, that the GOP really is more the working man's party than was seen before? And can that continue? Do you think do you think there will be people like Liz Cheney just wanting to flush all that down the toilet so that it's all people like her in cowboy boots running the party again? Or will there be an aesthetic shift within the party so people feel like they could identify with the party, people who perhaps felt that they couldn't before?
The Republican Party is not the party of country clubs anymore. I mean, it is the Democratic Party. And you're seeing this. This was actually a big issue in Georgia, where a lot of these like upper middle class suburban white families thought that they were being anti-racist by voting for Biden and not Trump. What's interesting is that you've seen Ted Cruz is not a dumb guy. I mean, he's got some issues, but he's not a dumb guy. He's actively trying to pivot on this working class coalition sort of issue. Marco Rubio is paying lip service to it, and this is kind of the concern, right? The biggest threat is not like Bush and Romney coming back and taking over the party. It's someone like Dan Crenshaw, who has kind of Bush era sort of sympathies, but is much smarter in his packaging. So he's kind of got this action figure sort of approach. It was inevitable that Donald Trump style politics would give birth to like Michael Bay Republican politics, which is like Dan Crenshaw's political commercial he had. So like fake explosions and all of that. That's where the real battle is. I think it's trying to go push up against the Dan Crenshaw Trump aesthetics with Bush era appeal. The opportunity is definitely there. The question is, what does the party actually do? What do the actual legislators? We've elected a bunch of good legislators in these houses. What do they focus on? And I think one of the interesting rifts going forward, I read about this when we had the gun protests going on in Virginia. One of the biggest drivers here in this larger kind of rural versus urban political divide is college education. White voters with postgraduate degrees are like the most leftist voting bloc in the country, right? And when you just get into white voters with college degrees, young people in particular, right, are that is another. It's not quite as bad as the other, but it's bad. If you're a Republican state legislator, your focus right now should be defunding state colleges. Not only is it good policy in the fact that we have a massive overproduction of college degrees, but it's just good practical politics because you're grooming voters that are typically going to be Democratic voters. One of the most interesting maps from selection was, what are the districts where Trump overperformed 2016? The strongest gains were on the border itself in Texas. And that was interesting because one of the narratives, Cuban voters, but Cuban vote in Miami are voting one way, but that's fine because Cubans are very different voting bloc than Mexican voters. Well, again, it was a Hispanic change across the board. It was also true with Asian Americans. They actually elected several new congresswomen. Speaking of people that don't look like Fox News anchors, I think that there's a lot of pushback to again that this cultural leftism. And so if the GOP maintains its Trump hostility to political correctness and can get serious about the dangers of leftist indoctrination in public education And again, and the COVID era, again, has accelerated some of this with the increased scrutiny of K through 12 public education and other things, right? So again, there's trends that can be taken advantage of. But at the end of the day, no matter how good stuff works in theory, it ultimately requires state legislators and activist types and people of influence acting upon these things. So again, there's an opportunity there where I think these gains can be solidified and turned into practical policy. It's just a question of whether you can translate it into policy, act in the policy, and succeed on that policy. And that is where, in these next 4 years, great opportunity. Whether it is acted upon is a different question. But again, that is where we will be following them and commenting and tracking how they do going forward.
All right, well, we're going to have to let it go with that. I'm Ryan McMakin with the Mises Institute with Tho Bishop. Thank you for listening to Radio Rothbard, and have a wonderful week.